Imagine a world with no phones, no watches, not even electricity. Yet somehow, over 700 years ago, humans figured out how to track every second. But how did they build a working clock with zero power? The answer will surprise you, because the first clock didn't just tell time. It changed history. If you're curious about the forgotten inventions that shaped our world, don't miss out. Hit that subscribe button and unlock the past with us every week. Let's take a second and think about just how complicated a modern clock or watch is. Even a simple quartz watch has hundreds of parts inside that tiny casing. It's a wonder we can even tell the time down to the exact second. Before electricity, before batteries, and before wires, humans found a way to track time. The first clock was built with nothing but gears, gravity, and genius. This clock was huge, over 6 feet tall, and it had incredible accuracy for the time period. In fact, it was so accurate that it remained the most accurate timekeeping device in England for over 100 years. Instead, they used escapement wheels, a type of gear that regulates the motion of another gear, allowing for a steady and continuous motion. They're essentially the opposite of a modern-day switch. It was likely born between 1230 and 1240. He died sometime before 1305. It fell again in 1653, but it was rebuilt again. The replica clock was inaccurate enough to tell the time within a minute, or even a few minutes. If you've made it this far, we know you've enjoyed it. Just make sure to leave your feedback down below, and we'll see you next time. But according to historian Derek Howes, the replica was probably close. He says that the original clock was probably accurate enough to measure time within 5 or 10 minutes. That's not bad considering the technology of the time. But how accurate do you think the clock was? Let us know in the comments below. Today, the tower stands at 127 feet tall, and it houses a replica of Richard's original clock. As you might expect, there's been quite a bit of debate surrounding the original clock. Historians still don't have all of the details figured out, but that hasn't stopped them from trying. In 1954, for example, a team of engineers and historians set out to recreate Richard's original clock. They spent years studying historical documents, conducting experiments, and collecting old clock parts. Their goal was to design a new clock that looked just like the old one and told time in exactly the same way. After 5 years of hard work, they finally finished their masterpiece. The clock was built in the style of a 13th century tower, and it used traditional techniques and materials. It even had a weight-driven escapement, just like Richard's original clock. Unfortunately, the clock never worked properly. The escapement was too weak to drive the clock's hands, and the whole thing had to be dismantled after just a few months. But that doesn't mean the project was a failure. They learned a lot about medieval engineering, and they also built an incredibly cool clock. His origins are unknown, and his last name may have been a reference to where he lived rather than a hereditary surname. We do want to know anything about his family, and we're not sure if he had any formal training in engineering or mathematics. But we do know that he was well-traveled and that he was very smart. He may have studied in Paris, and he was clearly familiar with astronomy, optics, music, and mechanics. Plus, he was really good at writing. Most of what we know about medieval life comes from written accounts, and Richard was one of the best writers of his time. He wrote about everything from the temperature of wine to how musical instruments produce sound. So you might be wondering, why would such a smart guy build a clock tower? Well, the answer is simple. He was hired to do it, sometime in the late 1260s. Bishop Richard of London hired Richard of Wallingford to add a clock to the spire of Salisbury Cathedral. As we mentioned earlier, the clock was a huge success, and it remained the most accurate clock in England for over 100 years. Eventually, other cities like Oxford and Cambridge built their own towers, but none of them were as accurate as Salisbury. A switch allows current to pass through until you flip it, at which point you break the circuit. An escapement wheel lets no current pass through until it's clicked. This is what allowed the medieval clock to tick. Every 60th of a second, a tooth on the escape wheel would drop into a notch on the gear below it, releasing energy and allowing the wheel to rotate slightly. When the wheel rotated, it would move a pointer along the face of the clock, marking the seconds. Every 10 times the wheel rotated, it would trigger another gear, moving the minute hand. And every 12 times the wheel rotated, it would trigger the hour hand. These escapement wheels were powered by falling weights, which is why the clock tower needed to be so large. It needed enough room to house a heavy weight that would slowly fall over the course of 24 hours. Water clocks were used to keep the weight in motion. As the water flowed, the weight would slowly descend. By the end of the day, the weight would hit a mechanism that rang a bell, signaling the end of the day and winding the clock back up. So you see, the clock was basically a series of weights and gears connected together to an elaborate system of bells and pulleys. All in all, it was a pretty impressive feat of engineering. But how did this massive contraption even work? Now let's break it down. Well, the first thing you should know is that the clock wasn't built all at once. In fact, it was a gradual process that took several decades. What started out as a simple weight-driven bell tower quickly evolved into something much more complex. At first, the tower housed a single bell and a heavy weight at the top. Weights were connected to the bell by ropes, but there was also a large crank that could be turned to wind the bell. Over time, these weights and ropes were replaced by gears and chains, and eventually, the clock tower took on its final form. But how did it actually work, and who created it? That's what we're here to find out. But if you go back in time about 800 years, everything changes. So we know that clocks have been around for a very long time, but do you know how long? Believe it or not, the oldest surviving mechanical clock in the world was built in 1275 AD. That's right. Of course, there are plenty of different types of clocks, but the majority of them rely on one thing: pendulums. A pendulum is essentially a weight suspended from a pivot so that it can swing freely. The period of a pendulum, or the length of time it takes to swing back and forth once, is remarkably consistent and only changes when the angle of the swing is very large. If the weight isn't perfectly horizontal, the longer the pendulum, the slower it swings. The shorter the pendulum, the faster it swings. And every single modern clock relies on this mechanism because it's incredibly predictable. Pendulums still have to be manually wound though, which means that someone has to start them up and then stop them to slow them down. Not exactly efficient. For most of human history, telling the time meant looking up at the sun or the moon. For centuries, people would use sundials and water clocks to estimate the time, but those methods are obviously unreliable. You can't read a sundial during the night, and they are inaccurate enough for something like banking or astronomy. So people wanted something better, something more precise, and they got it. In 1275, a clock tower was built in the English city of Salisbury. To understand how this clock worked, we need to learn a bit about how clocks work today. Most historians believe that the medieval clock builders didn't use pendulums at all. But we still have some questions. How did they get the clock tower built in the first place? Who was behind this incredible invention? Now, the person credited with building this clock is a man named Richard of Wallingford. What we know about him is scarce. Now, the original tower was destroyed in a storm in 1386, but it was rebuilt shortly thereafter. The question is, how accurate was it? Well, that's tough to say. Speaking of which, now it's time for you to give this video a thumbs up